Last week, Russia debuted a new weapon that has never been used in the history of warfare, an intermediate range ballistic missile of a new type that has previously existed with conventional warheads, which have potential strategic effects. That was used by the Russian side in response to the United States specifically, and then Britain and France following after that, authorizing the use of their long-range weapon systems to be used inside of Russia. Now then, it seems though after the Russia had shown with its using what's called the Oreshnik missile and demonstrating that there are no Western defenses against it, we seem to have ignored it still. And at least according to press reports out today, the United States authorized another strike of ATACMS missiles deep into Russia. And now then Russia is claiming they are going to respond. We've basically put Putin backed him into a corner to where he either has to make good on his threats to escalate this further and use more of these weapons or to back down. Not sure that's going to work out well with us. And to try and really pick through the ramifications of this, we have on our show, I think for the first time today, Patrick Henningsen, who is a geopolitical analyst, a journalist, and the host of the SundayWire.com. Patrick, first of all, just welcome to the show. Really glad to have you here.
Thank you for the invitation, Daniel. It's a pleasure.
And I've been on with you a few times I went on your show once. We've been jointly on some of these X Spaces live. So I've always enjoyed our engagement, and our folks who may not know you are certainly going to be in for a treat today with some of your really good analysis and opinions. Listen, let's just jump right into this because, Putin was pretty clear why he, first of all, used this Oreshnik weapon. Before we even talk about the details of the weapon system, let's first of all kind of back up a little bit and see how we got here and what Putin said prompted his use of this weapon.
I'm talking about what happened in the wake of long-range Western weapons being used in the Special Military Operations Zone. As a result of the escalation, in the United States and their NATO allies said that they give their permission to use long-range weapons against targets inside Russia. Experts know fully well, and the Russian side has underscored this time and again, that using such weapons without the direct involvement of military operators from manufacturing countries is impossible.
Gary, by the way, sorry to interrupt for just a second. Do you still have that clip of Sabrina Singh talking about the Western weapon? Is that still loaded up? If it's not, is it something you can get loaded up pretty quick? I would like to refer to that.
I know that you say that you don't want a wider war
Sure.
and that you don't want it to escalate, but it looks like it is kind of escalating from both
U.S.
sides.
forces aren't in the fight. You don't see, the only other foreign country that's been brought into this fight is North Korean soldiers on the battlefield. But you're not seeing, U.S. fighters on the ground. And that's not the intention of this administration.
You're right. You're saying
Gary, that's good enough. Yeah,
Russia
we can pull
Ukraine,
that from
that's
right there.
correct.
I wanted to play that because you have Putin right there saying only because America used long-range weapons did we take this action here, because they can only be fired with the direct participation of the United States military personnel against Russia. And then you have here just a couple of days ago, the Department of Defense spokesperson Sabrina Singh saying, you don't see us on the ground there. We're not fighting. It's not true. I mean, what do you make of that?
Well, firstly, we can look at the political dimension of this in the context of the transition between the Biden administration and the Trump administration. But what this raises is the real fundamental question. And we have to look at this from the Russian perspective. It's very important because, look, we're all concerned about war breaking out. And if war breaks out, there's going to be two sides to that war or multiple sides. So it behooves us to try to understand what Moscow is saying. I know that's like heresy from the current Washington mindset, which is anti-diplomatic. Right. We'll get into that in a minute. But so the United States rhetoric is that, the U.S., and our media has gone along with this, by the way, the U.S. is allowing Ukraine to strike using U.S. or British missiles into Russian territory. That statement in itself is like a total indictment of Ukrainian sovereignty. But let's put that aside for a minute. We've allowed Ukraine to use our weapons to strike in Russian territory. How Russia views this is different. Russia's looking at this as is NATO at war with Russia? Quite simply, that's the Russian question in this. It's not the internal NATO discussion about what Zelensky can do and what he can't do, because Russia's not looking at it in the infantile terms that the West has framed this. It's all about framing, and this is the problem. So Russia's looking this as a reverse Article 5. So the Article 5 trope that gets bandied about constantly in the West is attack on one is attack on all, which is total misinterpretation of the NATO treaty anyway. But Russia's saying, well, if that's the case, then an attack by one is an attack by all of NATO on Russia. Ergo, we reserve the right in our revised doctrine to attack the source of what we believe the threat is coming from, i.e. could be NATO bases in NATO territory. Now, the question remains, would that be a nuclear attack or a conventional attack? It looks to me like Russia has demonstrated with the Oreshnik missile that this will be a conventional attack. So Russia's always been pursuing a conventional deterrent, okay? And so we're in an arms race, as you and many of your guests have talked about in the last year. We're absolutely in an arms race, but this is the conventional arms race. Russia is winning in the conventional arms race, and it is strictly by the geography of this conflict. We have no business being in there. We don't have a strategic advantage. The United States or NATO do not have a strategic advantage in Ukraine against Russia. All we can do is cause a lot of problems and provoke Russia in order to have an overall escalation, in order to create the type of tense situation we have right now. And everybody who benefit from that, they're all obviously cheering for this right now. So, but we can talk about the politics of this later if you want.
Yeah, I absolutely do. But because it tails in there together, I want to look at one of the things that Putin pointed out after the first one was launched. It should have been self-evident, but in case anyone is unclear about what the countermeasures the NATO side has, Putin said this.
There is no way to counteract a missile that flies at 10 Mach, which is 2.5 to 3 kilometers per second. Existing anti-missile systems and the anti-missile systems deployed by the United States and Europe cannot intercept such missiles. It is impossible.
So now, given that, you talked about the political aspect of this. There's some aspects of that I want to talk about. Politicians always want to talk a lot, and they want to make things, spin things into their advantage. But at the end of the day, there's still, at least has been, some sort of reality that cannot be penetrated through, and you got to deal with what's actually there. Now, given that we've seen this missile with our own eyes, and we, by the way, had MIT professor Ted Postel on recently to graphically explain why these can't be intercepted and how dangerous they really are, especially if Russia has a number of them. So that should say, okay, we don't want to push this any further. But President Biden's coming in about 6 weeks or so from now. The Trump administration. Biden had the better part of 3 years to try and do something on the battlefield and help Ukraine. It didn't work. It was a disaster. They've done nothing but lost ever since territory and personnel and their future, I might add. But now here comes Trump, who was elected on a requirement and a demand by the people, and he ran on that he was going to end the war. He said that since he's gotten elected he is going to do that. So rationally, politically, you would say, all right, let's start working together seamlessly for this transition. So on January 20th, the United States itself is on a similar course, and yet we still seem to be missing something because we have allowed the weapon to be used again, despite what's already known there. How do you explain that?
Well, I said when this happened, I was on a program, the Duran, when I was in Budapest this past week, and Alexander Mercurius and his Alexander Christophorus asked me this question about the Trump administration. What do you think is the political calculus here? And what I said was, at the time, and I still believe this is true, if there was a sufficient backlash to this move by the Biden administration to sort of green light attacks in Russia. When I say a backlash, I'm talking about strong political statements of condemnation coming from Republicans, coming from the Trump administration, and by the media and by European leaders. In other words, this clearly should be framed as a provocation by a lame duck outgoing Biden administration. If that's the case, it would provide a great platform for which an incoming Trump administration could say, what, Biden's crazy, wants to blow up the world. This old man is a zombie president who is basically doing the worst possible thing. In fact, I'm quite shocked that Trump hasn't come out publicly and made these proclamations already. And to me, so he could use this as leverage. What Biden's doing is leverage. It might very well be used as leverage to force negotiation from other NATO partners. But is that the level of 5D chess that the incoming Trump administration is playing? It doesn't seem like it. It really doesn't, because I'd see more activity in terms of the chess match in the media, and I don't see any of that happening. So it makes me very concerned about what's actually going on here, and can Trump well and truly be hemmed in by these events that would preclude any sort of negotiated settlement, because the British are still running with the line that Putin's bluffing. That's the British line. Putin's bluffing. He's not serious. He's drawing all these red lines and he's not enforcing them, which is a preposterous analysis on its face. So what's actually going on here? What you need to look at is, we can talk about technology and deterrence. By the way, these Russian missiles are all nuclear capable. That's just on the side a huge threat. Now, why wasn't that an issue before? Because this isn't the first time we have advanced intermediate range IRBM or ICBM missiles. These have existed, and on the West we have the Trident system as well, and Russia has other systems that have been operational. Because before, there were non-proliferation and anti-ballistic missile treaties in place, multiple treaties that were designed to prevent the type of international stress to the international system that we're now facing. And each one of those treaties has, in some cases, been unilaterally withdrawn from by the United States. The Trump administration, I believe, withdrew from the INF treaty in 2019. So, and this brings us to some other important questions. I mean, I don't want to go on too much of a critique of the Trump administration here, the first Trump administration, but the brand that Trump got elected, and he has a mandate. Trump has a mandate with the American people that the American people do not want to see this Ukraine situation go any further. They want to wind it down. They want peace. But with that mandate, you also, the brand of Trump being a peace president, if you look at some of the things that were done in the first Trump administration, let's be very honest, a lot of them have brought us to the crisis point that we have now, withdrawing from the INF treaty, dismantling the JCPOA treaty that put Iran into a nuclear threshold position. People will argue that the Abraham Accords were the pretext for October 7th, the reaction by the Palestinian liberation and militants and Hamas and etc. On October 7th. So that's a legitimate critique, in my opinion, and needs to be looked at, because you have a lot of hawks in the incoming Trump transition team. Marco Rubio is not a peacenik, and he's the Secretary of State candidate. He's called Russia a country that's a gas station with nukes. I mean, that John McCain trope. Yeah. So these are not, in my opinion, these are not people who have a really serious viewpoint of international relations and appreciate the sensitivity of the environment that they're walking into.
So let me ask you, what do you think is the Biden administration's intent or purpose? Anything you do has to have some sort of a purpose or an end state. You want to achieve something or so. Now, in addition to what Biden has done by allowing these missiles to be used, and then that was followed in suit by both Great Britain and France, has now said the same thing. Great Britain and France, by the way, adding to what you said a second ago, are also openly talking about maybe putting troops in Western Ukraine. So I've got to ask, what in the hell is going on with these three people, Biden, Keir Starmer, and Macron? What is their objective here? And do you think they're actually talking about all this stuff together.
Well, look, let's just preface this by saying that the European leadership, I'm not talking about the people of Europe, the European leadership are so deeply invested in this proxy war against Russia in Ukraine, because that's exactly what it is. There's still people denying that that's what it is, but that's exactly what it is. So Emmanuel Macron, the last 2 or 3 British prime ministers, they've had so many in recent years, but the latest one as well is deeply invested in this war narrative with Russia, that we need to stop Russian aggression, because if Putin has its way, they're doing the old communist domino theory, which is that, oh, if Ukraine falls or Putin's, not even if Putin overruns Ukraine, but if he's seen to have won, i.e., Russia enters into a negotiated settlement with Ukraine and Europe and is seen to have gained something from it, then that's the equivalent of a defeat. Ergo, it's encouraging him to overrun Europe and march all the way to Calais in the English Channel, which is completely ridiculous. But this is basically what politicians in Britain and in Europe are talking like, and it's just ridiculous. So I think that's the biggest problem, is these people have staked their political careers, they've staked the entire their institutions they've gambled everything on Ukraine. And I call this, and maybe I'm being too flippant, but I'm calling this NATO's vanity project. This is a vanity war of an institution that's fast reaching its sell-by date. We're talking about the North Atlantic Treaty Organization.
Yeah. Nobody wants to think about that. But see, these kinds of actions can accelerate that, not prevent it. And, it's one thing to have a desired outcome. I'm invested in something, whatever. But there has to come a point to where you acknowledge that there are limits to your desires, and they run against a concrete reality. And Putin is doing everything he can to try to show where that concrete wall is. Here's what he said also, and I think this was a day or so after those previous clips we showed you were from, where he said, hey, this was not a one-time missile. We actually have more.
Ракетная система «Орешник» — это не просто эффективное гиперзвуковое оружие. В силу своей ударной мощи, особенно при массированном групповом применении, да еще и в сочетании с другими высокоточными дальнобойными системами, которые также есть у России, результаты ее использования по объектам противника будут сопоставимы по эффекту, по своему могуществу с оружием стратегического назначения. Хотя по факту система «Орешник» стратегическим оружием не является, во всяком случае, это межконтинентальная баллистическая ракета.
And they're continuing to say, hey, there's more of these coming. This was not one time. We have additional weapon systems, and even more than just however many Oreshniks they actually have, that there's more to come. Now, that's compounded by, in our previous show, I won't go through all those things again, but Julian Rupka, one of the most honest, I think, pro-Ukrainian, but honest reporters out there on his Twitter feed. He actually put something today, a show out there where he graphically depicts how the Eastern Front and the Northern Front in the Ukraine side is crumbling and collapsing fast. By the week now, large numbers of square kilometers are going. The Ukraine side doesn't have enough men. So literally everywhere you want to look, from tactical, operational, and strategic, this thing is falling apart. So wouldn't it be in the interest of the Europeans to try to put the lipstick on a pig, if you want, to end this, as opposed to pretending none of those things exist and potentially running headlong into a brick wall?
No, there's a lot of good reasons not to escalate. Unfortunately, there's this thing called the bandwagon effect in the international relations system, and Europe is so much on the bandwagon regarding NATO. It's a U.S.-led and a British-led bandwagon. What's funny is I was just in Central Europe this past week, and even speaking to some of the top ranking commanders in the Hungarian military and their foreign ministry, and they're not hawkish at all on Ukraine. They want to see, the consensus is they want to see a ceasefire. They share a border with Ukraine. And it's funny, Daniel, the further you get away from the front line, the more hawkish the rhetoric. That everybody, Slovakia, Hungary, everybody who stands to lose the most from an expanded conflict is less hawkish. In Poland, the national conversation is changing rapidly, and the hawkish rhetoric coming out of the Polish political establishment and so forth, it's dialed down significantly from where it was even a year ago. So that's interesting. So there's the real dilemmas, though, is we're stuck in a huge rut. There's a treaty dilemma. All of these lapsed agreements, the ABM agreement, the INF, the Open Skies, and the list goes on and on. This New START treaty. All of these lapsed agreements have created an environment of potential chaos where things can happen, and once things escalate, then once things cascade, you can't turn back the clock. Russia's operating on a dead hand system regarding nuclear exchange. So it's a foregone conclusion what's going to happen. I know Scott Ritter and other people in independent media have talked about the threat of this. We have the treaty dilemma. We have the diplomacy dilemma. There's no diplomacy going on. We have the censorship dilemma. The West has censored out all Russian media and statements by Russian officials. You've thrown up some, headlines and statements by Vladimir Putin here, and that's highly instructive. But Daniel, I don't see any of these clips being played on any of the main U.S. media outlets. Where do our politicians get their information? From the media.
Man, listen, we played a clip from this past Sunday to where Rebecca Koffler was being interviewed on Fox News, and she laid out, that when she was in the intelligence community, when she was in the CIA, that they had war gamed out some potential scenarios that could result in nuclear war breaking out between the United States and Russia. And she says, so far, we're like right on track. You see, we actually war gamed this, and it was heading in that direction, i.e. we are heading in that direction. And it's like she had been speaking in, I don't know, Greek or something, because the next words out of the anchor's mouth was, but the Russian side is losing. They're not doing very well. And in fact, they're on the brink of collapse. And I was like, well, on what planet are you from that someone's telling you this and you actually believe it? And I think that really underscores your point there, just how bad the information stage is for the West.
We're suffering from the thing that the Soviet Union suffered from before its imminent demise.
Ooh, that's a painful analogy.
we are, where it was politically a death sentence to criticize whatever the government central party or whatever the government's saying. That's what it's like in Washington. That's what it's like in London. That's what it's like in Brussels. Everybody is scared to death to criticize. And look, let's just be clear. If this thing ended today, NATO could come out and declare a victory. They could say, we stopped Russia at Europe's border, and look, we've added Sweden and Finland, and look at all the military gear that we have in Poland right now. So if you're talking from the military industrial complex perspective, they've moved the line of contact between East and West in the militarized line of contact further east. So they could easily declare a victory and kind of have a frozen Cold War 2.0 for the next 50 years. And if you go by Julian Assange's thesis, which is that the point isn't who wins the war, the point is that the war continues and that the military escalation and arms race continues, then they could declare victory. And share prices can remain high. And isn't that what it's all about? Is the S&P 500 and share prices of major contractors. And the fact, listen, let me tell you something else. There's 47 new U.S. bases going in Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Denmark. 47 in Scandinavia. That's more. That'll be the most militarized U.S. Region on the planet, even more than the Middle East. And that's where the U.S. establishment is investing its money as we speak right now. So whatever the result of this is in Ukraine, this is not over because the money is parked in a long-term escalation, making Europe now much more, I think, volatile in a Cold War 2.0 situation, or maybe worse.
Well, maybe that's some of the reason for Zelensky's commentary is because here's what he said a couple of days ago, completely oblivious to all the tactical, operational, and strategic things that are working against him and his own manpower crumbling. he's still talking like this.
The United States has approved a $275 million package, including munitions for HIMARS, as well as javelins, drones, and mines that we urgently need to defend positions, particularly in the Donetsk region. Germany has provided a new package as well. Sanctions are no less important. This week we have new U.S. sanctions against Russia, very effective ones against the banking sector. These measures significantly weaken Putin's system, and we need more of them. He must constantly lose the means to finance its war week after week. And no matter how much Russia tries to blackmail everyone it can, we must not lose our resolve. We must keep pushing, and only in this way will real peace become closer.
I mean, how can you square that with the reality that we've been talking about militarily, economically, every other way? He's literally talking like, yeah, this will just keep going on forever. We got more money and, cool. Let's just keep fighting.
The consensus is already that sanctions have failed. I mean, that's luckily one of the positive things is that's come out now, and people are talking about, hey, we tried these universal sanctions against Russia. It's actually backfired and it's killed the European economy. And we need to look at possibly unwinding these. Starting to have that conversation in Europe and even in the United States now. But what Zelensky is doing is he is kind of hiding behind NATO's muscle on this, and in that sense, he's a complete paper tiger who's he's practically expired by now. NATO allows, what it does is it allows the United States to mask what is kind of an imperialist, you could say, agenda behind the fig leaf of a multilateral defensive alliance, quote, defensive alliance. And while simultaneously this affords smaller countries like the UK, like France, to sort of punch above their weight, Germany, Norway as well, to talk and act tough and to start wars in a sense by wielding the sacred Article 5 scripture from the holy book of the rules-based international order, and use that as the sort of threat. That's what's got us into this problem that we find ourselves in right now, which is on the precipice of a potential nuclear confrontation.
Patrick, here's one of the things that just really puzzles me. I'm being sincere here. You laid out one of the most remarkable scenarios that the West could take and say, hey, how do we put lipstick on this pig? How do we come out looking something like, I mean, it's really good. I hadn't even thought of a lot of that stuff. It's great the way you articulated that. We could do that now. That would then, and we can take the morality of this as separate another time, but you could say, hey, look, all right, this didn't work out. Cool. Let's freeze it right here. Keep these new 47 bases you're talking about. All the rest of Europe, if they want to, remilitarize and, make money and all this stuff, they could do that. They could succeed in doing that right now by just making that decision. But instead, we keep taking action that could materially worsen the situation here and could literally be the death knell of NATO militarily. So this is what Lavrov has been saying, by the way, that's look, if this turns into a hotter war, whatever Russia is going to do to respond, as they have said to today's ATACMS strike deep, they're going to do something. Putin has indicated that they were going to use more of these missiles somewhere else. We don't know what's going to happen. But every time that does, then we risk escalating it further. But Lavrov said not too long ago that, hey, listen, America, you guys need to be clear on something. If there's a World War III, it ain't going to be limited to just Europe. He's subsequently said also that, don't think your oceans are going to protect you, because we have the capacity to make good on that. Now, you also retweeted something by another person here a couple of days ago, which I thought was really instructive in talking about the Oreshnik and the consequences of this. He said, now all U.S. aircraft carriers can be destroyed in minutes. All U.S. military bases, all underground bunkers, all ICBM space launches, naval shipyards, etc., can be destroyed with non-nuclear kinetic energy via the Oreshnik, i.e., we are really, really vulnerable to what Russia has here. And if this escalates, there's not a win for us here. So why then, Patrick, are we not taking the win that you so beautifully articulated and going down something that could literally result in our loss?
Well, one of the things is when the Bush administration withdrew from the ABM treaty or allowed it to lapse, when they're talking about positioning missile systems in Europe, they sort of made it about Iran, that Europe needed a missile shield because of the threat that Iran might hit Europe, which is completely ridiculous, especially at the time. Iran didn't have those capabilities. What they really want, what Washington and NATO really want, is they would like some all singing and dancing broad global missile treaty that will contain Russia, Iran, and China, and North Korea. And guess what? They're never going to get it. The best thing that we ever had, what brought peace and security to Europe, were all of these non-proliferation agreements and all of these bilateral agreements between the Soviet Union and with the United States. And instead of maintaining those and then winding down NATO expansion, we did the opposite. We accelerated NATO expansion after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and then we allowed all of these fantastic bilateral agreements that help to bring security and stability to Europe, the West, and to the East. We just obliterated them. Why did we do that? Who actually benefits from that? It's to me quite amazing. Maybe the defense industry benefits from it. Maybe there are people who honestly believe. We hear people talking about winning a nuclear war. I've seen a lot of these think pieces. I'm sure you have too,
Yeah.
Daniel. I mean, it's just kind of crazy thinking. But what we do see is a pragmatism on the part of the Russians, that they say, look, we can mount a conventional deterrence. We have that much of an advantage on our missile technology. All these missiles wouldn't be on the table if we still had the anti-ballistic missile treaty, the ABM, and the IMF. This whole class of missiles would be off the table. We wouldn't be talking about this. It's just, to me, and quite extraordinary, breathtaking, that we're having this conversation now after the work that's been done by all of our state departments, from successive administrations, from John F. Kennedy to George W. Bush. That all of that is just gone, and to me, it's just amazing. And why isn't Donald Trump appointing anybody that is talking about reestablishing these types of bilateral treaties and articulating these in advance? Because that's the real work that's going to be required. Otherwise, it's going to be impossible to have any meaningful negotiated settlement with Ukraine in the absence of any meaningful talk about indivisible security that works for Russia, Europe, and the United States, for everybody, not just for one side.
And do you think that's something I was going to ask you anyway? Given all that's happened so far, and God only knows where it's about to go in the near term, even maybe before Trump even gets inaugurated, is there any scenario, and maybe a better question is, what would it take for the U.S./the West to ever get back to a point to where there is even common purpose and an acceptance of one another? Or are we doomed to always treat each other as enemies until finally one day something does blow up into a nuclear exchange?
The biggest problem, the biggest threat to world peace right now, the biggest threat to European security is NATO as an organization. Because do you really think for a second that NATO, that is led and mainly funded, and the operational head is the United States for Supreme Allied Command, it always has been, it is a U.S.-led organization, that if the United States pulled out of NATO, do you really think that Europe would be, as these European leaders in Germany and the UK and France would be as hawkish as they are right now against Russia? No, they would be running for security assurances, and they would want to resume trade, and we wouldn't be seeing any of this. That's the fact. And NATO provides a Trojan horse to dictate European economic, political, and military affairs. And this has been proven beyond any shadow of a doubt in the last 3 years. And so that, to me, is the beginning of the problem. NATO either needs to have a reevaluation of its purpose and possibly look at pulling back and winding down and having some agreements put into place between the West and Russia, or we're going to go down a path that, frankly, is irreversible and is going to entail major conflict. And that's not going to be good, especially for Europe. United States might be far enough out of range for some of the threats that might ensue. But like I said before, the closer you go to the front line, you start to hear more sane conversations happening in Central Europe than you do. The further you go away, the more crazy the talk is.
And that is so disheartening, because there's so much, I think, cultural and certainly economic potential for coexistence, mutually beneficial for East and West here. And it's just it's heartbreaking to see this lust on the part of so many, at least of the elite in the West. I certainly won't categorize everyone. You and I are obviously exceptions to that we think that we can get along, and that there doesn't have to be this obsession with military power and military force. Like the only thing anyone can do is to think about that. Diplomacy is dead in America, as I've said on our show many times. And if we don't change that, Patrick, then it may be us who is dead at some point, because this thing can escalate into a nuclear war, despite what so many people like Jack Keane and what's his the other guy. I said that other general that used to be the head of the U.S. military, Ben Hodges. They just say there's not going to be any. They literally scoff at the idea that Putin would ever use nuclear weapons, because he knows what would happen. John Bolton famously said on this that we showed on this channel here, and he said, "Look, there is no way, because Putin knows it would be his death warrant." Oblivious to the fact that if it's his death warrant, then it's also our death warrant. That is the shocking thing to me, that these so-called elite in our country that are on the television channels all the time, and people keep letting them go on there. That's the stuff that they're saying, and it could potentially harm all of us, possibly catastrophically so.
Yeah, I see you've got not admirable.
Let's clarify that.
The Admiral Bauer from the Netherlands there, who has become a sort of loud U.S. hawk, a NATO hawk in all of this, and they're talking about preparing Europe for nuclear scenarios and so forth. But it's to me, it's a huge failure that. Especially when you listen to the like you said, General Keane and all these hawks that are on Fox and CNN, they talk. And I'm saying this because I hear it all the time from the European press, that Putin's bluffing, that he's Piers Morgan does this all the time. Putin's drawn these red lines and he's not enforcing them, so he's not going to do anything. That if you actually study game theory, and the sad part, Daniel, is that people who are experts in game theory are either retired or they've passed on to the next life. Okay, so they're not around. You can find technocrats and engineers and policy wonks in the Rand Corporation that could explain this perfectly fine, but I don't hear any of this coming from anybody in any serious foreign policy position. Just because you don't enforce a red line in game theory, each time you cross over a red line that's been set by your opponent, you raise the stakes of that action with each time, because the other party, in this case Russia, can decide at what point to call in all of those wagers by the West. And if you let things escalate and escalate and escalate, that is the broader game theory, that none of this infantile analysis that we keep hearing from those people you just mentioned. That's embarrassing, actually, especially people who served in the military. They should know better. That Russia can enforce that red line at any point in time in the future. And when it does, it has the justification it believes anyway, on a moral level, on a military strategic level, okay, and also on a legal level from an international law point of view. And all of those things matter when history is evaluating the actions of any state actor. And that's the problem we have.
Let me ask you this in the last few minutes that we have here. What does game theory tell you Russia may do now? Because they used the Oreshnik. They gave a clear warning. We kind of said, yeah, here's what I think about your warning, and that we allowed more missiles to be shot. Now then they're saying, they have now put their name out there and said, we will respond to this. So what do you think the game theory would say that Russia would hit next? And how dangerous is it that we might not even get to January 20th without something going out of control?
I think Russia's pretty rational and pretty pragmatic the whole time. So I mean, to predictability, it's very predictable. They have said that any subsequent strikes, they will respond immediately in proportional fashion. So I have no reason to disbelieve those statements by Moscow. So I don't think there's a great threat, provided the United States doesn't do anything really stupid.
Well, what might that look like? What might they hit? Because if they got to hit something proportional, what might that be?
It could be. They did hit a command and control center in the latest barrage of ATACMS and Storm Shadow missiles into Russian territory. Now, Russia can take a certain amount on the chin, knowing that they will wager that there'll be an incoming Trump administration, and they'll see this as either provocation or some sort of pre-negotiation leverage, and rightfully so. They've already probably thought this out. So I think I'm not worried about Russia. Let's just put it that way. I'm not worried about Moscow, because, people, the other crazy caricature that the West has developed when talking about Russia is that Putin's decided what Putin wants. If we can get into the mind of Vladimir Putin, it's not Putin. Russia has a major national security institution, a consensus that comprises of thousands of people. They create a consensus on any major national security issues, and then that consensus is then relayed through their executive, i.e. Vladimir Putin. He doesn't alone decide these things. These are well thought out doctrines and means which are decided upon with the Russian intelligence, with their political establishment, their huge foreign policy establishment, their academic institutions, their defense leaders and generals as well. This feeds into this massive Russian consensus with regards to security and foreign policy. So it's very predictable. They say everything, and everything's on paper. They're not hiding anything. They're not hiding behind proxies. Okay. The opposite of what Washington and NATO is doing, which is using Ukraine as a proxy, and in order to shield a broader agenda that the West is trying to do through Ukraine, which we can all agree, and even the incoming Trump administration has said during the campaign, is a total failure. So will Donald Trump be able to have the courage, the conviction to stand up against the war machine? He has a mandate. Will he be able to execute it? That's the big question.
Okay, and we'll see how that works out here. But the last question I have is, one of the other things that Putin said in the immediate aftermath of the first long range missile strike was that they reserve the right to strike outside of Ukraine if this continues on. So the question is, you talk about how you're not worried about Russia, and I'm guessing that this next one also will not be escalatory, i.e. outside of Ukraine, probably some strike inside of it, maybe using the same Oreshnik, who knows. But the question is going to be, if even after that, we still keep allowing Scalp or Storm Shadow or ATACMS to be fired, and they actually hit something that's painful for Russia, then I think that Putin is going to be up against maybe even his own national security people. Like you said, he, despite the way he's characterized in the West, doesn't have dictatorial powers. And I've been hearing from some sources that are connected, or at least claim they have some connection to Russia, and say he's under a lot of pressure to do a lot more, and they've been mad that he hasn't so far. If we do something after this current round here, before January 20th, do you think that the chances rise that he might actually have to do something outside of Ukraine?
A lot of this depends on how this is viewed globally. Okay, because if in a way Russia's kind of at a big advantage from a public relations point of view after this latest barrage from the West and Ukraine. And if let's say Russia takes another one of these or another two of these on the chin, okay, and then at some point, let's say they're threatened closer to Moscow, as an example, or another early warning nuclear radar system is hit, which Ukraine have already hit earlier in the year, which is 1,000 kilometers inland into Russian territory. Now, if Russia then responds to, let's say, a conventional strike hitting a NATO facility in Poland, okay, how is the world going to view that? Is the world going to view that as Russia has stepped over a red line, or is the world going to view that as is Europe going to be able to view that as Russia is responding to repeated provocations from NATO? Because that's what matters. What matters is what Europe thinks in that case, Daniel, not what the United States thinks, because Europe will decide whether Article 5 is going to fly or not when they go into consultations in Article 4. Okay, so that's the big question. I am willing to bet in that case that Europe would want to hit the brakes at that point. They don't want to go full bore into it, no matter what the hawk.
We certainly know that Fico and Orban will be leading that charge.
For sure, and maybe the ones that are going to save us are going to be Orban and Fico in this story. Those will be the voices of sanity that will start a chorus in Europe, people like that, and then eventually the people in Germany and France and the UK and in the Netherlands and France are going to basically become very vocal, saying we don't want a major war in Europe. No, thank you.
You know what? I wish, Patrick, that those voices would be saying that today, not after whatever we find out is going to happen. They should have already said something. I'm praying and I'm hoping that we get to January 20th. And then I'm going to start praying and hoping that Trump actually does what he said and tries to get this thing off the table, because this is, I think, just a hair's breadth away from going really bad. And I think that too many people are not aware of how serious this is.
No, and I think the sooner this conversation becomes a little more lively, especially in Europe and eventually in the United States, but then I think we will be able to see some daylight on this. But at the moment, I'm not hearing enough from the Trump camp just repudiating this in a loud way. I think it's an open goal for Trump. If he wants it, he could score. Very easy score before.
I agree. Yeah, I'd like to see that too. Well, listen, thank you so much for coming on today, Patrick. Absolute delight to have you on. Look forward to having you back on real soon.
Yep. Thank you, Daniel.
And thank you guys as well. And also thanks to Bob for that very kind Christmas gift that you gave there to the channel. We're very grateful, Gary and I both, and really appreciate it. But we appreciate all of you guys. We consider it a privilege to get to bring you shows like this. And as a reminder, especially to those of you who may not be aware, I know everybody can't watch all of our videos, but I know that some of you can listen on podcasts. We are now on the podcast world, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podcast Addict, wherever you get them. Type in Daniel Davis Deep Dive, and you will find us eagerly waiting there for you. Thank you very much. We'll see you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.